Let me just. Okay, well, it's so nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's nice to see some familiar names in the Zoom. So for those of you who know me personally, you might not know professionally that I work for the Forest Service. I have for about 2 decades. I'm an ecologist, and I actually am stationed here in Quincy, but I do cover 3 national forests. So my work covers the Plumas, Lassen, and Modoc national forests. And for all of you who are probably really familiar with the Forest Service, you won't be surprised that a lot of what I do is focused on fire. You know, as an agency, we're really focused on trying, wait, let me see if I can't. There we go. I can move my slides. Just a second. Sorry, technical difficulties. Okay. So as an agency, you know, we're really focused on trying to implement treatments like fuel reduction or restoration, often in landscapes that haven't burned in centuries, with a real focus on trying to increase the resilience of those landscapes to future fires. You know, anyone who lived through the last few summers knows that the Forest Service is also really effective at suppressing fires once they ignite. But I think one thing that's really interesting is that as we've seen these kind of increasing trends in both wildfire size and severity across California and really across the West, there's been this real shift in focus, and it's been really focused more towards the restoration and management of burned landscapes. And there's a lot of uncertainty about how we approach post-fire management, not only in the Forest Service, but across a lot of different land ownerships. And I think a question that a lot of us are really grappling with, particularly after last summer, is how do we effectively restore these burned landscapes? And traditionally, a lot of our post-fire restoration happens, you know, in the immediate aftermath of the fire. You know, we focus a lot on mitigating those real short-term impacts of the fire, things like stabilizing slopes or mitigating for erosion, really trying to address those immediate effects of the fire. And sometimes our restoration actions or our post-fire restoration actions can be pretty limited in not only the scale that we do it at, but also the scope. You know, a great example is we often focus a lot of effort on hazard tree removal and salvage, you know, really focusing on removing dead trees and hazards around places like communities or around important infrastructure like roads or trails. And we also have a really important but very narrow focus on reforestation, you know, really trying to reestablish forest in places where it's been lost by planting. But as those of us who live in Plumas County know, we've seen a lot of these landscapes, you know, burn not once, but multiple times in sometimes pretty short succession. And when we overlay that with these really dramatic changing climatic conditions that we're seeing, you can imagine how we're really starting to recognize the need to expand our approach to post-fire restoration, to really be much more broad and much more long-term, and really thinking not only about just mitigating those kind of more immediate impacts from the fire, but also thinking about how we increase the resilience of these burned landscapes to future disturbance and changing climatic conditions. One of the tools that we've been developing here in California is this post-fire restoration framework for national forests in California. This is a general technical report that our ecology group recently published. And we're really hoping that it can be useful for some of these managers that are really trying to approach some of these large burned landscapes. With this framework was developed by a pretty diverse group of Forest Service scientists and managers, and it took us quite a number of years. And while it's focused on national forests in California, it can really be applied to almost any land ownership almost across the West. And the purpose of this framework, the reason why we put so much effort into developing it, is really to try and provide, you know, this science-based ecological roadmap for how we go about kind of identifying these management options after we experience these really large fires. And as I mentioned, it's published as this general technical report, so it's a pretty thick book. And I have hard copies that I'm happy to distribute if you want to read them or put them on your bedside table to get you to sleep at night. It's also available online. But really what this framework does is it provides just some background on, you know, why we need to do ecological restoration after wildfires. It provides this kind of process for how you might take this really large burned landscape like the Dixie fire, for example, and identifying where on that landscape might be most in need of management. And it also provides some really nice case studies covering kind of this broad, diverse group of vegetation types. So not only conifer forest, but some sagebrush, chaparral case studies as well. And it provides these case studies just to demonstrate how managers might apply a framework like this to a burned landscape. And it also has some really nice appendices and tools and goes into a lot more depth than I will tonight about how you might actually complete an assessment. What this doesn't do, and I think a lot of people probably get disappointed when they find out this particular fact, is that it doesn't tell you what to do after a fire. Instead, it really just is meant to provide this framework for how we think about burned landscapes and how we might really approach developing and identifying different restoration opportunities. And so I'm going to actually go into a little bit of the detail here, and I'm going to provide a case study on some work that we've been doing on the Dixie fire, where we applied the post-fire restoration framework to actually try and identify parts of the landscape that we might move forward on for restoration. So one of the strengths, I think, of this framework is it really challenges us to think about these landscapes a little differently. You know, not only to think about those things that are really time sensitive, you know, things like planting trees and removing hazards, which are really important, but also to think about those actions while also thinking about them in the context of these longer term restoration goals. And also thinking beyond kind of the most severely impacted areas. You know, a lot of times when we're thinking about restoration, we gravitate towards those areas that were severely burned, you know, those places where we definitely have lost a lot of our vegetation. And instead of thinking just about those severely burned areas, this framework really gets us to think about not only those places, but also where the fire might have been more restorative, you know, where we might have opportunities for management that might include maintaining those conditions that were actually created by the fire. I think it challenges us as managers to think a lot more creatively and broadly about the tools that we use oftentimes in post-fire management, dead tree removal or salvage, you know, and reforestation, but thinking about using those tools to actually meet maybe a broader range of objectives. So for example, using dead tree removal to reduce fuels instead of just focusing on economic recovery. And then most importantly, I think it challenges us to think about all of these different things, which can be pretty complex, but also always having kind of an eye to the future, you know, explicitly thinking about how stressors like climate change, future fire, and invasive species are really going to impact these landscapes, and how we can really design management actions to take not only the effects of the fire into account, but also consider how these future stressors and present stressors interact with those effects. So the framework has these 6 kind of guiding principles that kind of guide the development of the process. And these are going to sound really familiar to anyone who's interested in conservation or restoration. But the first is really, you know, focusing on restoring ecological process. And this is really important, especially when we're talking about trying to restore natural fire regimes, which should be definitely an end goal of a lot of our restoration projects. It challenges us to think about the fire in the context of the broader landscape. So thinking about not just what happened within the fire perimeter, but how that fire might have influenced the watersheds and the unburned areas around that fire. So thinking about, you know, direct and indirect effects of the fire, and thinking about how we can kind of treat that landscape as a whole. You know, thinking about things like promoting regional biodiversity, plants, birds, animals, sustaining a real diverse suite of ecosystem services. And then the other thing it really asks us to do is to prioritize management on these landscapes. You can imagine how, for example, with the Dixie fire, we have over 1 million acres of burned landscape to deal with, right? So we need tools that actually allow us to prioritize those landscapes and figure out where on that landscape is the highest priority for management intervention and when those interventions need to occur. And then really, again, just trying to think about all of these things in the context of change, like climate and changing disturbance. So these 6 principles provide the foundation for this restoration framework, which then I'm going to go over today and talk a little bit about. And then that framework and the outcomes from that framework feed right into project planning and implementation. And then because I'm an ecologist and I love monitoring, I always have to make a plug for monitoring. Our monitoring of project implementation and planning really helps to create that feedback loop that helps to really inform and reinform the restoration framework process. So the framework itself has these pretty 5 simple steps. And I'm going to get to it. There we go. There's 5 simple steps. The first one is pretty simple. Assemble a team and figure out what you're going to look at and what your goals are. And this does seem really simple, but it's something that we really need to explicitly do to get a really good sense of what our overarching goals are. And these goals and objectives can come from forest plans, conservation strategies, management plans. They can come from really anything, but they really need to be specific, and they really do offer those kinds of sideboards for how you're going to approach the landscape and identify these opportunities. The second piece is gathering and analyzing all of the data you can find, and it should be spatial. So this is really thinking about, how did the fire affect the resource that you're interested in? Thinking about gathering data on what vegetation was there before the fire. How did it burn? In terms of burn severity, what are your priority resources? Do you have species of conservation concern or certain biological hotspots? So trying to think about all of these spatial data sets that can really inform how you might identify opportunities on that landscape and then prioritize them are really important. And then the third step is to use this post-fire flowchart to identify, to really break down that big landscape into these broad bins where you can start to identify restoration opportunities. And I'm going to show you an example of that tonight. And then the fourth step is really getting together with your team and further developing those opportunities and really trying to integrate them and prioritize them into these restoration actions. So in the end, you get this, what we call a portfolio of actions that really help you identify what you want to do, where you want to go, what your goals are, and what your actions are, and then also provide some information on timing and feasibility that are really important when you're talking about restoration and management actions. So I want to just kind of walk through this post-fire flowchart because it really does provide kind of the heart of the framework. And then I'm going to give you an example with the Dixie fire, because I think that can really effectively show how we kind of use this framework in a real world scenario that has impacted a lot of us on this call. So the first question when you're dealing with your large burned landscape is simply asking, where did the fire improve and maintain conditions, and where did it degrade them? Where were fire effects within what we consider to be the natural range of variation? And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So really partitioning your landscape into areas where the fire degraded conditions and where the fire might have improved conditions is the first step in this process. If we're just thinking about areas where the fire might have improved or maintained conditions, then we ask ourselves, are there other factors that might threaten the resilience and sustainability of those ecosystems? So thinking about factors like future drought stress or continued risk of severe fire or vulnerability to insects or disease or invasive species. All of these factors are not directly impacted or related to the fire, but they do provide that additional stressor that might actually instigate having to do something or really wanting to do some sort of management in those areas. If those factors are absent, and we really did have truly beneficial effects of the fire, these are areas where managers might consider maintaining or promoting those conditions that were actually created by the fire, using things like prescribed fire or some sort of other similar management action that can actually build on those beneficial effects of the fire. And I think that's really a cool part of this framework, thinking not only about how fires might degrade ecosystem sustainability, but thinking about how they actually might nudge these systems a little closer to a restored condition and how we as managers can really help to promote those conditions. But if we move to the other side of this flowchart, the part where we have pretty degraded conditions, these are areas that have burned really severely. Then we ask ourselves, where are management approaches feasible, especially considered, not only current conditions, but what we anticipate to occur in the future. And in places where restoration is feasible, then we would want to take management actions to restore those conditions. In areas where it's not feasible, we might actually have to reevaluate some of our goals and conditions. I think of an example of this being some of the low elevation forest types that we have on the Plumas National Forest, for example. Some of these areas have burned at really large patches of high severity fire. And they're also in places that are anticipated to be, pretty stressed in the future in terms of climate. So having, a lot of drought stress in the future. These areas might be unlikely to naturally regenerate to conifer anytime in the near future, and particularly under this kind of warming climate regime that we're seeing. So in these places, we might actually consider, especially if they're on, the steep slopes of the Feather River Canyon, we might actually consider some of the other ecosystem services that, say, hardwood forests or regenerating chaparral, montane chaparral might provide, things like wildlife habitat or soil nutrients, things like biodiversity or watershed integrity, all of these important ecosystem services that this new kind of novel condition might provide. So thinking about not only where restoration is feasible, but where it might not be feasible and how we still might think about those landscapes in a new way. So I know this is kind of high level and hard to take in on a Thursday night, but I wanted to kind of bring it home with a case study. I don't have to introduce any of you all to these fires, I'm sure, but I wanted to take some time to present some work that I've been doing with colleagues for the last 4 or 5 months on the Dixie and sugar fires, just to show you how we might use a big landscape like this and try to identify opportunities on it. So you probably don't need introduction to the Dixie fire, but some of you might not be familiar with the sugar fire. This burned in the southern boundary of the forest, and it burned into the southern boundary of the Dixie fire. So these two fires ignited, within weeks of one another. They combined and to burn over 1 million acres across just this really wide range of land ownership. So you can see here that it impacted the Plumas National Forest, the Lassen National Forest, Lassen National Park, and then a number of different private land ownerships. And really just the sheer magnitude of these two fires created a huge management challenge, not only for the Forest Service, but for these other land ownerships. And in some cases, we have a pretty narrow window of opportunity to actually affect change on these landscapes. It also really presented this great opportunity from my standpoint to try and apply the concepts that were presented in the post-fire restoration framework. So we started to do that pretty much right after the fire was contained. So as I noted in my intro, we had those 5 steps, and the first step was to assemble a team, identify those resources that we were going to concentrate on, and then really try and highlight and identify those specific goals and conditions that we wanted to focus on. So I was really lucky to have a pretty engaged group of managers and scientists from our research station and from our the Plumas and Lassen National Forests. And we identified 2 key resources that we really wanted to focus on. The first was these mixed conifer forests. Now, this was the dominant forest type on these landscapes before these 2 fires occurred. And they're characterized by pine and fir forest. And historically, they would have burned really frequently and often predominantly at low to moderate severity. So they would have burned frequently, oftentimes removing the surface and ladder fuels or surface vegetation, but really keeping that overstory relatively intact. We also picked the California spotted owl to do the assessment on. I'm not going to talk about that tonight, but I'm happy, although I should have, because I'm talking to Audubon, I just realized. but I'm going to focus on mixed conifer forest instead. I really want to note that while we picked these 2 resources, there are so many resources that were impacted by these fires. And really, this is just a place to start. And it's not exclusive to this. And really, it's just providing that really focused lens that you look through when you're trying to evaluate what the fire did and how you can respond. So we picked mixed conifer forest and owls, and we had these 3 big goals. The first was to reduce the risk of severe fire in priority areas. This is, in and around our communities that we live in areas that provide habitat for spotted owls and other old forest habitat, really trying to reduce the risk of future severe fire. The second piece is trying to increase the resilience of those forest stands that actually survived the Dixie and sugar fires to make sure that they can survive the next fire or the next drought, really trying to make them resilient to future disturbance when they occur. And then the third goal that we had was in those areas where we did lose forest, in those places that burned really severely, we wanted to try and facilitate the recovery of that forest, either through natural regeneration or reforestation, so active planting. So in this presentation, like I said, I'm going to focus on mixed conifer forest. And as I mentioned, it was the dominant vegetation type in this area before these fires occurred. It occupied about 73% of the landscape, over 700,000 acres. And if you look at this pie chart, what this shows is the severity distribution within these forest types. So you can see that about 50% of the mixed conifer forest within the Dixie and sugar fires burned at high severity. So this means that more than 75% of the trees were killed by the fire. And what it also means is that we're looking at about 400,000, almost 400,000 acres of conifer forest that were present before the fire that are probably no longer present and may not be forest in the future without some sort of intervention. So the next step in our process, if you remember, was to do the post-fire restoration framework flowchart. So this, again, remember, allows us to partition this 1,000,000-acre landscape into these two broad bins, based on what the fire did and how it impacted forest conditions. And we really begin by asking, where did the fire effects burn? Where were fire effects within what we call the natural range of variation, and where were they departed? And you'll hear me mention this natural range of variation often, or NRV. And what this really means in terms of our assessment is that stands that burned at low to moderate severity, or these kind of small patches of high severity, these are what we would consider to be most aligned with how we think these forests burned prior to settlement, historically, when they were most aligned with their natural fire regime. And these really have the highest potential for conditions to have been improved or maintained by the fire. In contrast, when we talk about conditions that are outside of that natural range of variation or outside of NRV, we're really talking about these really large patches or contiguous areas of high severity fire that, again, are really unlikely to naturally regenerate in the near future. So if we first focus on those areas, that part of the flowchart where we're thinking about the areas that were departed from NRV, or areas where we think that fire effects were really departed, we used two different data sets to really try and identify these areas on the landscape. And the first was that patch size of high severity fire. The graph here just shows the number of high severity patches by patch size. So if you look at that green bar there, you can see that we have over 3,000 patches of high severity fire that are less than 100 acres in size. This is what we would consider probably to be close to what might have happened historically in some of these ecosystems. In contrast, you can see that 67% of that, the area in the circle, was actually in these really large patches. And if we think about the largest patch, it's over 30,000 acres. It's just north of Lake Almanor and kind of stretches from Lake Almanor all the way up to the national park. And that patch alone was over 30,000 acres, which equates to about 50 square miles. So I think it's really important to think about not only how these systems are burning, but the patch size that they're burning at. And why do we care? Why is this important or concerning? I think it's really important to know that historically these forest types were adapted to pretty small areas of high severity fire. And that's mostly because the conifer species that we have in these forest types aren't really able to disperse seed over very long distances. So what this means is that most of the interior of these really large patches that we have on the landscape are far beyond the range of seed dispersal for a lot of our species. So what that means is that we're really unable to get a lot of seed. Trees are really unable to get a lot of seed into the interior of these patches. We looked at this specifically using a model that we have that allows us to look at all these different factors and think about the probability of a conifer seedling being present 5 years after the fire. So this map shows the outputs from that model that I ran. And what you can see here is that in the brown, so in the kind of tan and brown, those are portions of the fire that are unlikely to have conifer seedlings in the near future. And that's mostly due to just the distance that those seeds need to travel. The blue, in contrast, shows some sort of probability, 60 to 100% of there being some sort of conifer regeneration in the future. But when we look at the entire fire, across the whole fire, what we found is about 54%, or more than half, of the area burned had pretty low probability of natural regeneration. So when we overlay these large patches of high severity fire, and we look at within those patches, where are the areas that are very unlikely to naturally regenerate, we find those areas that really we need to focus our reforestation or planting efforts. These are, we found over about 175,000 acres on Forest Service lands outside of wilderness, across the Lassen and Plumas, where we met these two criteria. And the restoration opportunity in these areas is really going to be to try to actively do reforestation, to really try and meet that third goal, where we were trying to facilitate the recovery of these forest ecosystems through reforestation. But so once we identify kind of these 175,000 acres, which is quite a lot, we need to consider a whole suite of other factors that actually come into play when we're thinking about where and how and what we do, right? We think about things like feasibility. This map here is one of those patches where we identified a reforestation need. And you can see here in the purple that these are areas with not steep slopes and that are less than 2,000 feet from a road. So these might be really important areas to prioritize if we're considering using mechanical equipment to prep our sites for reforestation, for example. But we might consider a whole other suite of factors when we're thinking about what might influence where and what we do. Thinking about things like climate, especially in reforestation. If we're thinking about areas that are projected to be drier in the future, that might influence, what species we plant, how dense we plant them, or even thinking about, looking at the landscape a little differently in terms of trying to pick sites that have the highest potential for micro refugia, where water might be more available in the future. We also might want to prioritize based on soils or site productivity or topographic position, or where other resources might exist. So there's these whole other suite of factors that we like to call filters that once we kind of identify those really broad opportunities for reforestation that we might overlay, different managers might overlay to really try and winnow that landscape down and try to identify priority areas for reforestation. So one of the things I mentioned about this, this framework that was really great is that not only do we think about areas that were severely burned, places where we might need to do reforestation, but also it really challenges us to look at that the other part of this landscape. And if we return to kind of that pie chart that I presented at the beginning, you can see that 50% of this landscape was severely burned, but the other 50%, burned at these other less than severe fire severities. So we had about 50% of our conifer forest burn at low to moderate severity. And in these areas, there's potential that forest conditions that we had may have been improved or maintained. And in these areas, we're really going to want to take a much closer look to try and identify restoration opportunities. Oops, sorry. So one example of this, of a place where the fire may have actually benefited the stands, is places that were treated prior to the fire and then burned at low severity. I mentioned in my first slide that the Forest Service spends a lot of energy trying to get ahead of these fires, really trying to implement fuel reduction and forest restoration before they burn. And in places where we can do that, and then we're lucky enough that these areas do burn at more low to moderate severity, what we're finding is these really beneficial effects of this combination of these treatments and this low to moderate severity fire. So when we looked across the Dixie Fire landscape, we found about 38,000 acres that had this really nice combination of treatment and low severity fire. And in these places, we're really trying to identify them as places that we might want to maintain those conditions into the future. So thinking about things like prescribed burning or fuel treatments to really try to maintain the resilience of those stands that survived the fire to those future disturbances. Another great example of this are places that have burned multiple times. You know, the Dixie fire was so huge that it burned through a lot of past fire scars. And some of us might remember, you know, the 2000 Story fire here in this map. You can see it. We had the 2012 Chips fire. We had a number of fires that the Dixie fire reburned. In fact, it reburned 83 different fires that burned over this 20-year period. And when we looked at this, we found that 33,000 acres had actually burned multiple times at that nice low to moderate severity. And what we found in our monitoring is that really this combination of repeat low to moderate severity can have really beneficial effects, particularly on fuels. So if you look at this top photograph here in the slide, you can see I took this 9 years after the Story fire. And you can see that while we have a pretty open stand, we have a lot of down wood on the surface. You can see the second fire, or the second photograph in the bottom of this slide. This was taken 5 years after the Chips fire reburned that same stand. And you can see how that second fire really cleaned up a lot of those woody fuels and really opened up the forest canopy. So in some of these areas that have experienced, you know, this really nice repeat low severity fire that's really similar to the natural fire regime, in these areas, again, as forest managers, we might want to identify them as places where we might want to maintain those conditions over the long term. Again, you know, thinking about how we can use managed fire or prescribed fire, hopefully at similar intervals to what these might have experienced historically, you know, to try and really maintain that resilience to future fire. But there was that other part of the flow chart, if you remember, where we had, you know, fire effects that were really beneficial. So they burned at this kind of low to moderate severity, but we may still have these factors that might actually threaten the ecological resilience and sustainability of these systems over time. And again, you know, we're thinking about future drought, stress, climate vulnerability, the risk of another fire being really severe, impacts related to insects or disease, and then also threats from invasive species. And when we overlay a lot of those factors, we find that we do need to take a closer look at a lot of these places that at first glance, we might think that the fire might have been beneficial or restorative. So to do this, we took our landscape and we tried to identify where on that landscape we had really highly departed conditions prior to the fire. So these were places that burned at low to moderate severity, but they might have never experienced, or they hadn't experienced fire in over 100 years. And so they were really characterized oftentimes by pretty dense stands, high canopy cover, you know, pretty dense conditions. When we combine that with this pretty low severity fire, we have this assumption that, you know, if conditions were really departed before the fire, that low severity fire might not have been enough to actually nudge that system, you know, closer to what our desired condition is. And in these places, we might actually need active management to kind of build on those beneficial effects of the fire and really start to move that landscape a little closer to kind of our desired conditions. And in some of these places, we might think about thinning, you know, to reduce tree density or restore heterogeneity or variability in these stands, or in some cases, you know, bring species composition more into alignment with more historical conditions. We might also think about going back into some of these places and reducing some of those fuels, especially if they were fire generated over time. So in some of these places where we would historically have walked away from, as managers, we're deciding that we might actually need to take a little bit of a closer look in some of these areas. One example that I just wanted to share of this kind of scenario are these small patches, kind of isolated patches of forest that we have. When I looked at the Dixie fire, we had about 14% of the forest that remained after the Dixie was found in these pretty small, islands, I like to think of them, islands of conifer forests, so less than about 250 acres in size. And a lot of these areas are now surrounded by these pretty large patches of high severity fire. And what we found in a lot of our monitoring and research is that a lot of these places that have burned really severely have an increased risk of severe future fire, especially over time as some of those dead trees start to fall and those surface fuels really start to increase. So the blue line in this map here just shows hypothetically, how as managers we might consider not only thinking about what's happening kind of within those green polygons where we have remnant forest, but really thinking about how they're connected to that larger landscape, and how if a fire were to occur in some of the red areas in this map, that there's a high likelihood with all that continuity that some of those small islands of conifer forest might be threatened. So in these places, we might actually design management actions to try and really increase the resilience of these isolated stands to future fire. So I wanted to just show you a little bit, a series of maps about how all of this kind of plays out in the Dixie fire. So that first step was to really think about what the fire did and what post-fire conditions looked like. So when we looked at the whole landscape, we had 40% of our landscape that we considered to be highly departed from where we wanted it to be. The blue represents areas that are probably still departed from desired conditions. These are areas that may have burned kind of within that desired range of severity, but where other factors might still be present, where we might still, as managers, want to take a closer look at some of these areas. And then a small fraction of that landscape, about 13%, were those areas that were treated before the fire and then burned, or have burned multiple times at that low severity, or had really nice stand conditions to begin with. These are areas where over the long term, we really might try to build on those beneficial effects of the fire and try to sustain that fire frequency and severity. So once we identified those post-fire conditions, we then really wanted to identify restoration opportunities. And you remember at the end of that flowchart, you kind of get these three broad bins. About 70% of this landscape we identified as a place where we wanted most likely to take some sort of management action. That could range from anything from prescribed fire all the way up to thinning or dead tree removal. This is kind of the range of actions that we might take after a fire. The blue is places where we're just not sure. We don't have enough data. Remember, these are data sets that are readily available after the fire. They're not data that we go out and collect because we want to do it relatively quickly. So these are places that we've kind of flagged to say, these are places where we might want to look at the conditions that were created by the fire and really try to design management actions tailored for those specific conditions. And then the green are those places, again, where we want to really maintain or promote those conditions that were created by the fire. And then lastly, we turn those kind of restoration opportunities into these actions. And here are just some examples. In the brown, you can see places where we want to target for reforestation. Those doesn't mean we're going to plant every acre, but these are really areas that met those conditions where we felt like they were burned severely, forest was lost, and they're very unlikely to naturally regenerate without some sort of intervention. The green are places where we want to consider things like prescribed fire, fuel reduction, or maybe thinning, to restore not only reduce fuels, but also potentially restore forest structure and composition. The blue, which you can't really see, are these really small pockets of fire-generated fuels, so places that might have burned really severely, but they're near communities or near high-value resources, places where we might be unwilling to risk a future high-severity fire. And then the purple and orange, again, are really hard to see, but these, again, are places where we're really going to be focusing on trying to manage some of those fuels that were created by the fire. So these turn into what we call a restoration portfolio, and I won't go into detail unless you have some questions, but each of these pieces has a line in our restoration portfolio. So you can see like places that are big patches of high severity fire, we're going to consider things like fuel reduction, site preparation and planting, control of competing vegetation, really all of those things that we do as managers to try and restore and replant after fire. Again, in places that were considered really departed before the Dixie fire occurred. So places that hadn't had any fire in the 20 years prior or even further, and were really departed in terms of stand structure. These are places where we might want to take management action, where we might consider reducing some of the fuels that were generated by the fire, or thinking about the need to restore, species composition in some of these places. So all of these, this big spatial analysis gets kind of boiled down into this table of potential management actions and restoration opportunities. So in summary, I know that was a lot and I'm sorry, but I really want to just introduce this framework because I think it's a really useful process. I think it's really important to think about frameworks like this, not as this set of defined tools or, kind of this cookbook for how we go about figuring out what to do after a fire, but really as something that encourages managers and landowners to think, broadly, and creatively, and strategically about these landscapes so that we can link, what we do at a pretty small scale to these much larger goals that we have for the entire landscape. And I think one of the benefits of this framework, which is really a bit different from how we've approached post-fire management in the past, is that it really encourages managers to identify, not only where we need to do active management, where we need to go in because we've had really important resources severely impacted by the fire, but also encourages us to look at across the entire fire and identify areas where we might have had beneficial effects of the fire. We might have had fire effects that really did some of our restoration work for us, and how we as managers can really build on those effects with some of our long-term management actions. And really, I think it's one of the biggest benefits of this framework is that it's really flexible. There's a lot of different opportunities to adapt it to different resources of concern, birds, plants, whatever your resource is. It really allows you to think about this landscape through the lens that you choose and really partition that landscape into some manageable restoration options. So I think that's all I have.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Michelle. If anybody has any questions, you can unmute yourself or put them in the chat. And I'm also going to drop those links that I mentioned earlier in the chat for our future events and our membership. I feel like a lot of the people here are probably already members, but I just think it'll be good to put those there. And then I will also be uploading this to YouTube so that you can share it with your friends and family as well. But if there's any questions, let me know. And again, thank you so much, Michelle, for your presentation.
Michelle,
Yes.
good to see you.
You too.
I have a limited number of crews and a limited amount of dollars. You give me a whole bunch of choices. What am I gonna be able to do right now on some percent of land where I'm not gonna have to pay for what I didn't do in 10 years?
Don. That is a terrible question. Just kidding. No, it's a great question. And I think I will say one thing. I will say, I think a lot of times we start with that question, and in doing so, we lose sight of the bigger picture. And I think if we can do something like this quickly, which, well, I mean, in Forest Service terms, we did it in like 6 months. That's pretty quick.
Yes.
But, if we can do something like this quickly, it allows us to look across these opportunities and take advantage of things like all of this money that we're now seeing come to forests like ours to do some of this work, which in the past we might have had to pay for. To answer your question, I think there are certain things that we do that are time sensitive. And I would say reforestation is probably the first of those, right? Like reducing hazards and reforestation are always going to be the most time sensitive. In terms of fuels, we have a bit of a window of time before we really start to have a fuel problem on some of these landscapes, although removing them becomes a lot more hazardous over time. But I would say that when we're thinking about reforestation, we can think about it a little bit differently than we have in the past. You know, so thinking about using that example of those islands of remnant forest, you can translate that to reforestation units. So we've been thinking a lot about, okay, oftentimes we go in before we plant and we reduce fuels, we reduce competing vegetation, and then we plant. But we need to think about how those planting units are embedded within this larger burned landscape. So thinking about expanding that fuel reduction to be much, much larger than just where we plant, because we see a lot of our investments burn and reburn over time. So I don't think I answered your question, Dawn, but I think that the point of this framework is actually to start at a much broader scale and then allow different managers to make that call based on the resources they have. Because, you know, a small landowner is going to have a lot different resources than the Lassen National Forest or SPI, or, you know, so depending on the capacity and the resources that each landowner has, I think that will really come into play in terms of how you prioritize.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I had a question about, you had mentioned the islands of mature conifers that are kind of surrounded by high severity fire. And I'm imagining that some of those might be fairly remote. How would you go about improving the fire resiliency of those islands?
It's really going to be site specific, but you'd be surprised at some of them that aren't that remote. And I think especially in places like that have been previously burned, so areas like the Moonlight Fire or the Chips Fire that have seen repeat fire over time, we're seeing kind of this erosion of these islands into smaller and smaller stands. It would all depend on kind of your site characteristics. But if you were in an area that you were able to treat, you know, I would consider not only thinking about what's happening in the stands, so thinking about maybe using prescribed fire or thinning to reduce fuels within those stands, but then having some sort of buffer where you consider removing a lot of those snags and down fuels. And you can do it in what we call like kind of this inverted salvage. That's what we've been talking about. You know, a lot of times we think of dead tree removal as salvage and recouping economic cost. But I think right now what we're starting to see is not so much a need to recoup economic cost, but really a need to reduce future fuel load. So that might be thinking about not taking the most economically viable trees, but a lot of those smaller snags that really present that fuel load problem. Now, Dawn might argue with me because I think it might become economically inviable to do it that way. But I really think if you're thinking about it from an ecological perspective, you want to really start to target a lot of those dead and down fuels in that buffer. And how big it is going to depend on your topography and where it is and situated and how fire might spread through it. So in flatter areas, you might be able to go a lot narrower. In steeper areas, you might have to go a lot wider. I don't know if Julie, that gets at your specific question, but I mean, I think the truth is that you're going to have to manage those fuels over time by removing them.
Great, thanks. And kind of related to that,
Cindy.
I remember on past fires seeing shrub growth like the ceanothus and the manzanita tends to overtake the conifer trees, and there's always a lot of controversy about using herbicide. Does the high severity fire present an opportunity in some places?
I can't hear you, Julie.
I'm sorry, it must be our internet connection.
I think I understand your question though, and I think it's a really interesting one and one I've been thinking a lot about. So this is my take, and this is based on observation, just having experienced after the Dixie and other fires. So after that first fire, if you have an area that hasn't burned in a long time and experiences a high severity fire, you see a really, really pretty immediate shrub response. And I mean, when I was out on the Dixie fire, shrubs were resprouting while the fire was still burning. So you can have a really quick shrub response pretty quickly after fire. When you combine that shrub response with the fuels left from that conifer forest that just burned really severely, what we find is that those conditions, those post-fire fuels and that resprouting shrub vegetation tend to promote future severe fire. So these areas that burn severely once have a higher likelihood of burning again severely. So when you think about reforestation, after that first fire, I think you're going to still need to use all the tools in your toolbox in terms of planting. You're going to need to remove those fuels, which we call site preparation. You're going to need to control competing vegetation, whether that's getting in there very quickly with your seedlings and trying to get those seedlings in the ground before the shrubs respond too quickly, or using herbicides or using mechanical removal or whatever it is, and then planting. What's really interesting to me is that I've seen a lot of these landscapes now burn twice at high severity. So they burned severely once. We had a lot of fuels, we had a lot of regenerating vegetation, and they burned again really severely. That second fire, what it does is it really takes care of that fuel for you. I mean, it almost like removes all of that really coarse woody fuel. So you can almost, I've been thinking about trying to look at those areas as places that might be good candidates for reforestation, because you'll have a lot less work to do in terms of removing that fuel load, because the fire has already done that for you. You still will have the issue with resprouting vegetation being really strong competitors for those, planted seedlings, those trees. So you still will have to do something about some of that in terms of reducing shrub vegetation. Although we have seen that with that second severe fire, you're also getting a decrease in shrub cover. And I suspect a change in composition, because you have certain shrubs that can resprout and certain shrubs that need, depend on seeding. So you're going to probably get a lot fewer seeders and more resprouters in these places that are burning repeatedly at high severity. So long-winded question. I think it depends on whether the high severity fire is your first fire or your second fire, and that's really going to change how you respond.
Thank you. Great.
So when you plant trees, how is it determined what species you're going to try to recover the landscape with?
It's a great
species that burned, or are we looking ahead at global warming and different species doing better down the road, or what?
It's a really great question. And I think that's something that we're having a lot of conversations about right now. As an ecologist, I'm thinking about, recommending species that are going to have a lot better chance into the future. So thinking about pine or some a lot more drought tolerant species. We're also doing a lot of experimentation with seed zones or seed lots. So in some places, we're starting to collect and seed from, maybe lower elevations, grow those out and plant them at higher. So we're taking into account kind of that shift in elevation that we might see with warming climates. So we're doing not only changing up our species mix a little bit, but we're also changing up where we're actually collecting that seed from. So lower elevational bands. I've seen quite a few silviculturists now starting to change these and taking into account kind of the site conditions and where that's projected to be in the future. And I'm happy to see that, because I think it's a really important piece when we're thinking about putting a tree in the ground. It's going to be there for hundreds of years, we hope. So it's going to be experiencing a lot different climate than it's experiencing right when we plant it. So yes, we are considering different species mix, different genotypes, and different elevational zones when we're thinking about planting. We're also considering, changing the density that we plant at. In the past, we really did plant at pretty high densities because we were really focused on production, and we're really starting to rethink that and trying to offer a little bit more space and reduce competition between trees. But that also includes having to reduce a lot of that competing vegetation that Julie was talking about.
Thank you.
I had a question with regard to the whole ecological concept of primary succession, secondary succession. And it seems like in reforestation, we skip those first steps of primary and secondary, going right to the last step, which is economic. Are we looking at going back to what I would think is the more logical way to restore a forest, where we begin at the beginning?
Well, I think it's a hard thing, because I think when you think about succession and you think about these vegetation types, if we're talking about forest succession, I think without kind of jumpstarting the process, then it's unlikely to ever, or I shouldn't say ever, because I think that we will have trees on this landscape probably, but it's very unlikely that we'll have trees on this landscape for a very, very long time. So I think even when we plant trees, they're 2 years old, we're jumpstarting the process by a few years. And I think we're still considering those pretty early successional forests. When we think about this kind of mix of shrubs and forbs and hardwoods, resprouting hardwoods, and then in all of that you have these small developing conifer seedlings, which will take a long time to actually develop into that kind of mature forest that we're hoping to achieve. So I don't know if we're cheating the successional process, although we are definitely guiding it and manipulating it. I think in the absence of kind of intervention, we're going to have a lot more what we would consider early seral or early successional habitats, that kind of shrubland hardwood mix, which is fantastic and really important ecologically. But I think the scale that we're getting it at right now is so departed from what we would have had historically in these ecosystems that it's we're trying to kind of tip that balance back towards this intermix of forest and chaparral and hardwoods, instead of just being either all forest, which we have in a lot of our unburned areas, and we're lacking shrubs and early seral species, or all kind of montane chaparral and hardwood, which we have in a lot of our severely burned areas. So I don't know if that helps.
I think I do. I think the whole idea of community, when you look at a forest as a community, it seems like there really needs to be a lot of effort to try to recreate communities. And I don't often see that being done. And the other concern that I have about reforestation is that when you talk about a severe fire and then removing fuels, the nutrients that are necessary for reforestation to actually become a healthy forest, is there any study that's been done to find out whether nutrient depletion by removing fuels as opposed to chipping them and leaving them there might have a longer term benefit for the health of a forest?
I don't know. I don't know if there have been a lot of studies. My understanding is that in most, the biggest limitation that your seedlings are going to face are probably more water related than nutrient related. I think after fire, we have a pretty good pulse of nutrients. And really, when we're talking about the fuel loads after some of the fires that we're seeing, I like to think of it this way is a lot of our forests that have been unburned are really departed, in terms of what they might have been historically. And when they burn, we have fuel loads that are also really departed. So these are way beyond what we might have expected when these forests were burning really frequently and at low to moderate severity. So the nutrient balance is a lot different as well. I think when we're removing some of these fuels, I think we still are always going to have branches and down logs and things that are left on site, you're never going to be completely clearing it enough to like remove all of your nutrients, but it's really going to be site specific. But I do think that, and I'd have to look into this a little bit more, but my understanding is that a lot of the mortality that we see in some of our plantations and some of the places that we reforest are mostly related to drought and water availability than nutrient availability. But I could be wrong.
Can I ask a question? I know we're right at 8 o'clock, 8:02, but I just wanted to know if you could tell me anything about like soil remediation that takes place following these fires. I know your presentation focused on reforestation, but I guess I was wondering, like, we have our Genesee Watershed Improvement Project, which was burned through the Dixie fire, and most of it is private lands and Forest Service lands. But I guess I just wonder, I know I'm very familiar with like site prep and, you know, mechanical removal of, you know, the different chaparral species, but I guess I wonder what techniques might be used to improve the soil before going in and replanting, if that's something that occurs before the, you know, brush is removed, or if there's any work being, you know, taking place towards soil remediation. Because out on like Lone Rock Creek, for example, like it reminded me of what you were saying in places where it burned and then the shrubs regenerated in these like snag forests, and you have these islands, and then the fire came back through, and those places that burned in the past look like nuclear and
moonscape.
yeah, and they're right next to those islands. And I wonder, like, even if you were to put trees there without doing something to that soil, that's basically just like when you're walking through it, it's just like ash, how we can get those trees to stay once we plant them. Because, you know, you plant them and then if the fire comes back through again, it just seems like, how do you get it to really hold those trees and the return on your investment of the time and the money of planting there again?
That's a really hard question. It's a good one. You need to ask your board member, Kelby.
Okay.
You know, he's a soil person and water person, but because I don't really know. I mean, I think about what we do in terms of soil restoration, and I think it's mostly mitigating erosion and trying to stop erosion. You know, things like trying to stop movement of water across and over soils. I don't know what we do in reforestation units. I do need to put a plug in though. I think shrubs are really important. I just need to say that. And one thing that I think is, you know, a lot of times we have shrubs that facilitate, you know, they're really important for conifer development. And we find a lot of places where they can actually facilitate growth of conifers. So I'm definitely not a proponent of removing all shrub species. I like what Faith, I think, said, you know, just in terms of having this community approach and having kind of this intermix of, you know, those shrubs, which are really important nutrient, nitrogen fixers, contributors to soil health, present, as well as some of these regenerating tree species. So I can't speak about what we're doing. I'm not a reforestation expert by any means, but I work with some, so I can ask some questions and get back to you if you'd like.
I'd love that. Thank you. I think that what you've shown us tonight shows that although we've seen a lot of devastation and high severity fire, it allows us an opportunity through this framework to create, you know, to look at those goals and create more of a mosaic and bring things back towards that natural range of variation. And so, if anything, your presentation has given me a lot of optimism, and I hope everybody else is feeling that way tonight. And if there's no more questions, I can let everyone go. And thank you for presenting again, Michelle. It's been really, really great to hear from you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate speaking to your group. It's nice to see all your faces.
All right, everyone, have a great night.
Yes.
Thank you, Michelle.
And
Thank you, Liz.
Yeah, thanks for being here, guys.
Thanks, Tom.
See you, everyone.